A couple of weeks ago, we looked at 3 essential layouts, and now it's time for a deeper dive. Today, I'm focusing on what I refer to as the basic layout. It's made up of 2 main elements: one focal point, one sentiment. Probably the simplest layout ever, right? But it doesn't have to stop there. Let's look at some ways to customize this. The first and easiest way, I think, is to just not always use all white in the background. Last week, I made a bunch of layered ink smooshing panels, and just before I get to making today's examples of cards with a basic layout, I thought I would show you some ways of adding interest to them. My favorite is to add some stenciling. I've noticed that if I want to add a big stenciled area like this kind of flower thing from the StencilGirl stencil, I tend to use white pigment ink. This panel is made from Ranger watercolor cardstock and it's completely dry. The white will sit on top, and the intensity of the white is up to you and how much pressure and ink you use. If you wanted a really solid opaque white, you could add some white embossing powder and heat it up. But I'm happy with this almost ghost looking shape. Next, I like to add some partial stenciling with smaller shades. This is the teeny diamond stencil from a Colorful Life Designs. When I'm adding this, I like to use darker ink, usually one of the colors I used in the ink smishing, but it could be gray as well. Actually, here I used Queen for the Day, which is a darker purple than the flirty fuchsia. I use a fairly light hand and I just kind of put down a little bit here and there over the panel. Sometimes I move my hand up and down and then sometimes across. Now, I like to leave things as straight as possible, but you could shift the stencil and turn it a bit so that it's even more random, if that's a look you like. Okay, so now back to talking about the layout. I trimmed this panel down to a circle, and now that's pretty much my focal point. It's big and it's going to cover most of my square card, but it is still the focal point, which I'm happy with. And after all that work, I really want it to stand out. But it could be a pretty piece of patterned paper instead, so don't feel like you have to get too messy with the inks if that's not your style. Because my focal point is going to cover most of the card, I'm going to put the sentiment right in the center of it. I could just glue my white LDRS Creative Happy die cut on top, but I like the look of inlaid die cuts. Plus, it's going to give me an extra pretty happy that I can use later. I keep a box of pre-cut sentiments to make my card making efficient, so I have the perfect place to keep it. To finish my sentiment, I grabbed this label set from Ink Blot Shop, and I stamped the happy birthday with that same Queen for the Day ink. By trimming it down right to the edge of the stamping, I can actually cut the happy right off and just use the birthday word. So that's a clever way to get more from a stamp. I've talked before about how I don't keep much colored cardstock on hand, and I prefer to make my own with my inks, so I don't have to keep track of the scraps. But I do end up with quite a few white scraps, and over time I've been using them more and more to add dimension to my cards instead of foam tape. Here I cut a couple of circles that are just slightly smaller than my focal panel, and one of the neat things about doing this is you can customize the height just by adding another layer. I think I used 2 here, which gives a nice lift without making it too thick. For smaller items like this birthday, I tend to use the foam tape. I just snipped off a very small piece to use, but because the width of the tape is shorter than the sentiment, I cut the tape in half and I spread the 2 pieces so that the ends are supported, and there's a very small area in the center without tape. This will make sure that nothing sags or get bent. Phew, that's a lot, right? But there is one more thing, and this fits right in with that mixed media look. To add some sparkle, I ran some Stardust stickles around the edge. This is a new bottle and they're flowing pretty fast. But I don't worry about accuracy because I just like to kind of spread it out with my finger to give a more organic kind of look. Stickles are water-based and they can react with your water-reactive inks and change the color, so you may want to experiment before doing this on a final card. Now that was a lot of non-layout talk. Let's take a look at the card. All I did to finish it was to add a purple matte to the background. I made this by swinking the ink onto the cardstock and then spritzing with water for some texture, kind of match the feel of the focal panel. One focal point, although it's quite big, and one sentiment, but quite a different feel from the original example. So even though there's not much to a basic layout, you don't have to feel limited in any way. Okay, from here on in, I'm focusing on layout variations and not the panels themselves, so it should go a little bit quicker. One of my favorite ways to vary this layout is to leave out the sentiment and let the focal point do the talking. This works well for all occasion cards, but if the shape of your focal point is specific enough, people will know what it's for. I've cut a heart from honey gold cardstock, and I could leave the card like this, but with that deep, rich background, Even the more subtle glow of this gold feels like it's too bright for me. I grabbed this charming embossing folder from Concord and Ninth and positioned the heart so it'll end up being symmetrical. Then I ran it through my die cutting machine. Still, it's feeling a little too bright and shiny. So I grabbed something new I'm trying out, which is bronze metallic ink from Lisa Horton. And I put it on the edges of the die cut and then rubbed a little bit of it right over top. I cut a couple of smaller hearts as well, and I'll talk about them in a sec. Now, because the cardstock is slick, the ink won't soak in. So I wasn't sure if it would dry, and I gave it some help with my heat gun, and it did dry. So now back to those little hearts. It felt like one big heart is just very expected. So by adding in a couple more, it adds a little more interest to my focal point, which, let's face it, is the only thing on this card. I popped up the big heart with foam tape, although I could have used cardstock. Obviously, I'm not very hard on fast on this idea yet. And I glued the smaller ones directly to the panel. And I'm sure you've noticed this is an A2 card. This is one of the favorite panels I made, and I just couldn't cut it down to make a square. This is going to be my daughter's Valentine. She loves blue. For my next card, I've already trimmed down this panel, and I've added some white stenciling and some navy stamping. See that dragon skin kind of look? To add some definition without adding another layer of cardstock, I'm pressing the panel into my S'mores ink pad, which is a really dark brown. The watercolor cardstock really soaks up that ink and gives a nice thick border. Last time I did this, I opted not to experiment with adding more water to the edges. But this time I thought, hey, why not? Let's see what'll happen. Thought it might get really runny and add a lot of inky mess, but in the end, it really just softened the look a little bit, and I'm really happy with it. So that's something I'll remember for another time. For this basic layout, I'm making two changes. First, I'm moving the focal point and sentiment to the right side of the panel, and second, instead of adding a focal point, I'm taking it away. And what I mean by that is I'm using this little heart grid die that's from Catherine Puller, but it's been retired for a long time. And I cut little windows into my panel. Then I shifted the die and cut it again to create a larger grid. For my sentiment, I went back to my Ink Blot Shop label set and I stamped the I love you. Originally, my plan was to trim it down like I did last time and just have love you, but the length of the full stamp fit perfectly under my little heart grid. So this time when I trimmed it, I left it intact and I left a thin white border around it to help it pop from the dark background. One final thing to make those windows look a little more interesting, I used some foam tape behind the panel to pop it up. This will create some shadows behind the heart. So this focal point is just a completely different technique and in a different location, but the layout really is the same. Next, I used my least favorite panel. I really don't love those big blobs of the darker blue. And what I found is that the best thing to do with ugly panels is to die cut them. So this time my focal point is my sentiment. And the nice thing is I can choose the best area from the panel to cut the sentiment from. This works really well with big chunky sentiments, and these oversized sentiments from Waffle Flower are some of my favorites. I also die cut an old favorite daisy from Paper Tray Ink. These dies are so old, it was before we knew to put vent holes in them so we could poke them out. I just grabbed a piece of tape that acted like a handle to pull this die cut out. So because my sentiment die cut really is my focal point, and it has so much pattern on it, I'm going to put it on a white background, but I want to ground it. So again, I created a solid colored mat by swinking the dark blue ink over another panel really roughly, and then spritzing it with water and drying it. So here's the card, and maybe you're thinking, hey, there's a flower there. That's the focal point. And maybe you're right. My thinking is that because of the size, the sentiment really is the focal point. The daisy's more of an embellishment. And maybe the lesson is that we can invert the sentiment and focal point. But either way, I'm pretty happy with how I managed to rescue that panel. One final card using my leftovers. And that's one of the nice things about making my little square cards. I often end up with extras, and rather than put them all away, I thought I would gather them up and cut strips from them. I used a retired Ellen Hudson die, but there's a lot of strip dies around, or you can cut them with your trimmer. I mixed them up and glued them to a backer of printer paper. This helps hold them together without adding any bulk, so it's still easy to trim or die cut. I trimmed it down to the biggest rectangle I could make, and then I added a narrow purple mat and glued it to a white panel that had been embossed with that charming embossing folder that I used earlier. I finished with a retired mama elephant die cut banks. This is a really good marriage of both worlds, clean and simple and mixed media. How far can you go before a basic layout isn't a basic layout anymore? It doesn't matter. These layouts are just a place for you to start, and where you end up is totally up to you. All of today's cards are kind of color intensive, and they left that clean and simple feeling behind. Except that final one, where we got the best of both worlds. If that's more your style, here's a video talking about ways to elevate basic cards while keeping them clean and simple. I'll see you over there. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.